The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating Base Reaper like a blade through flesh. All units, this is Overwatch. We have a problem. Staff Sergeant Miguel Vasquez pressed his headset tighter against his ear, the urgency in the transmission controller's voice making his coffee taste suddenly bitter. Outside the operations tent, the Afghan mountains loomed like sleeping giants, their peaks still shrouded in darkness that would soon give way to what many suspected might be their final sunrise. The intelligence briefing had been clear 48 hours ago. A high-value target, codenamed Viper, had been located in a heavily fortified compound 12 clicks northeast of their position. What the briefing hadn't mentioned was that Viper had apparently received advance warning. What it hadn't prepared them for was the maze of interconnected trenches, the sophisticated air defense systems, or the fact that 3 previous extraction attempts had ended in catastrophic failure. Now, with a Navy SEAL team pinned down in hostile territory, and their window of opportunity closing faster than a coffin lid, someone needed to make a decision that would either save lives or end careers. "Overwatch, this is Reaper Base," came the response from Colonel Harrison, his voice carrying the weight of 27 years in uniform. "What's the situation with Blackbird 6? The pause that followed stretched like a held breath. Everyone in the operations center knew what Blackbird 6 meant. Everyone knew who flew under that call sign. And most importantly, everyone knew why she hadn't been cleared for this mission in the first place. Captain Ezra, Viper Cowery pressed her face against the small window of the ready room, watching the maintenance crews perform their final checks on the AH-64E Apache Guardian that had become more familiar to her than her childhood bedroom. The aircraft's angular silhouette cut against the fluorescent hangar lights like a predatory bird at rest, its 30mm 230 chain gun pointing toward the ground in what appeared to be either deference or preparation. She'd logged over 2,000 flight hours in various rotary-wing aircraft, survived 3 deployments, and earned commendations that filled a manila folder thick enough to stop small-caliber rounds. None of that seemed to matter when the mission briefings were distributed, and her name was conspicuously absent from the flight roster. The knock on the ready room door came exactly when she expected it would. Colonel Harrison entered without waiting for permission, his expression unreadable in the harsh artificial light. Behind him followed Major Chen Watanabe, the operations flight coordinator, and Staff Sergeant Vasquez, whose presence suggested this conversation would be recorded for posterity. "Cowery," Harrison began, his voice carefully neutral. "How quickly can you get that bird airborne?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying with it implications that everyone in the room understood but nobody wanted to voice. Outside, the first fingers of dawn began to probe the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood. Time was running out, and they all knew it. She turned from the window, her dark eyes meeting the colonel's gaze without flinching. "Give me 12 minutes, sir." The confidence in her voice surprised even her, but it was built on a foundation of muscle memory, technical expertise, and something deeper, a need to prove that the doubts and whispered conversations in mess halls and briefing rooms had been misplaced. The Apache waited outside like an extension of her own body, every system and weapon as familiar as her own heartbeat. "Sir," Major Watanabe interjected, consulting the tablet in his hands, "the weather window closes in 90 minutes. If we're going to do this—" His words trailed off as the radio erupted with urgent transmissions from the trapped SEAL team. Static-filled voices reported movement in the trenches, muzzle flashes in the pre-dawn darkness, and ammunition counts that were dropping faster than anyone wanted to calculate. Colonel Harrison's jaw tightened as he listened to the increasingly desperate radio traffic. 3 of his best pilots were already down, their aircraft scattered across 12 square miles of hostile territory like broken toys. The enemy had prepared for everything, except perhaps for the one pilot who hadn't been deemed suitable for the mission in the first place. Sometimes desperation makes decisions that careful planning cannot. "Cowery," he said finally, This isn't about proving anything to anyone. She nodded, understanding the subtext. This was about bringing people home alive. Everything else was secondary. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders like a familiar flight jacket, heavy but comfortable. Outside, the Apache's rotor blades began their slow rotation as the ground crew completed their final preparations. The pre-flight checklist flowed through her hands like a prayer learned in childhood. Each switch and dial confirmed with the precision of someone who understood that mechanical failure in combat wasn't just embarrassing, it was fatal. The aircraft's systems came online with soft electronic chirps and glowing displays, transforming the cockpit from a collection of dormant instruments into a living extension of her senses. The longbow radar dome above the rotor mast began its slow scan of the surrounding terrain, painting a digital picture of the world beyond visual range. "Blackbird 6, this is Reaper Tower," came the voice in her headset. "You are cleared for immediate takeoff. Godspeed." The words carried more weight than a standard transmission, acknowledging both the mission's importance and the personal significance of this moment. She'd been flying combat missions for 3 years, but somehow this felt different. This felt like everything she'd trained for had led to this single point in time. The collective rose under her left hand as she pulled up on the power, and the Apache lifted off the landing pad with surprising grace for something that looked like it had been designed by someone who believed aircraft should intimidate their targets even while stationary. The base fell away below her as she gained altitude. The geometric patterns of tents, vehicles, and defensive positions shrinking into a tactical map spread across the valley floor. Soon, only the mountains and the sky remained, ancient and indifferent to the human drama unfolding beneath their peaks. The flight toward the target area took 18 minutes at maximum cruise speed. The Apache's twin General Electric T700 turboshaft engines consuming fuel at a rate that left no margin for extended combat operations. Through her helmet-mounted display, Captain Cowery watched the terrain scroll past in infrared imagery that painted the landscape in ghostly shades of white and gray. Villages appeared as clusters of geometric shapes, their heat signatures suggesting morning cooking fires, and the quiet routines of people who had learned to wake up before the shooting started. "Blackbird 6, this is Overwatch," crackled through her headset as she approached the target coordinates. "Friendlies are marked with IR strobes, bearing 270 from your current position. Enemy activity is concentrated in the trench system running north-south through the compound. Be advised, they've got man-pads." The mention of man-portable air defense systems made her adjust her approach angle, trading directness for survivability. Getting shot down wouldn't help anyone, least of all the people counting on her to arrive intact. The scene below revealed itself gradually through the Apache's sensor suite like a photograph, developing in slow motion. The SEAL team's position appeared first, 6 heat signatures huddled behind inadequate cover, their IR strobes blinking with the desperate rhythm of a failing heart. The enemy trenches stretched across the compound in zigzag patterns that spoke of careful preparation and professional military engineering. Muzzle flashes flickered along their length like deadly fireflies, each one representing someone trying to kill the Americans trapped in the open ground. "Overwatch, Blackbird 6 has visual on friendlies," she reported, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "Requesting immediate clearance to engage." The response came back almost instantly, but not from Overwatch. Instead, it was the voice of the SEAL team leader, transmitted on the emergency frequency with the kind of desperation that cuts through radio protocol like a knife through silk. "Blackbird 6, this is Neptune Actual," came the transmission, punctuated by the sharp crack of incoming fire. "We've got wounded and we're running low on everything. Whatever you're planning to do, do it fast." The raw honesty in his voice stripped away any pretense about the situation's gravity. These weren't training exercises or carefully managed scenarios. These were real people in real danger, and their survival depended entirely on her ability to translate years of training into precise, lethal action. She began her attack run from the south, using a ridge line to mask her approach until the last possible moment. The Apache dropped toward the deck like a falling stone, its rotor wash kicking up clouds of dust that would provide additional concealment for the extraction. Through her targeting system, individual enemy fighters resolved into distinct heat signatures, their positions plotted and prioritized with mechanical precision. The aircraft's 30 chain gun swiveled toward the first target, its movement tracked by sensors that could distinguish between friend and foe based on heat signature, movement pattern, and designated safe zones. The first burst of cannon fire lasted exactly 2.3 seconds and expended 47 rounds of high-explosive dual-purpose ammunition. The effect on the enemy position was immediate and devastating. Bodies disappeared into the dust and debris, their heat signatures extinguished like candles in a hurricane. But the Apache's presence had been announced, and the compound's defenders began shifting their fire from the trapped SEALs to the aircraft that had suddenly become their primary threat. Taking fire, she reported as tracer rounds began arcing past her cockpit like deadly shooting stars. The Apache jinked left and right, its agility surprising for something that weighed over 20,000 pounds fully loaded. A shoulder-fired missile streaked past her rotor disc, close enough that she could feel the heat signature through the aircraft's sensors. Too close, much too close. The radio erupted with overlapping transmissions as the battle intensified. Ground controllers at Reaper Base monitored the situation through satellite feeds and drone footage, their voices providing a steady stream of tactical updates and course corrections. Blackbird 6, you've got more movement in the northern trenches. Grid coordinates follow. The numbers rattled off like coordinates to hell itself, each one representing another group of enemy fighters trying to prevent the rescue that was now their only hope. Captain Cowery rolled the Apache into a steep banking turn, bringing the aircraft's nose around toward the new threat axis. The longbow radar had already identified multiple targets, their positions displayed on her multifunction display like pins on a digital map. Each pin represented someone who wanted to kill her, and by extension, someone who stood between the trapped SEALs and extraction. The mathematics of combat were usually more straightforward than people imagined. Eliminate the threats, protect the friendlies, complete the mission. Everything else was commentary. The second gun run took her directly over the compound's central courtyard, where the enemy had established what appeared to be a command post based on the radio antennas and the number of people moving between fighting positions. The 13 cannon spoke again, its voice a mechanical roar that echoed off the surrounding mountains like thunder. Concrete barriers disintegrated under the high-explosive rounds, sending fragments spinning through the air in deadly clouds that swept the area clean of anyone not already behind substantial cover. "Beautiful work, Blackbird 6, came the transmission from Neptune Actual, relief evident in his voice despite the ongoing firefight. "You just cleared our 12 o'clock. We're moving to the extraction point now." Through her sensors, she could see the SEAL team beginning their movement toward the designated landing zone, two of them supporting a third whose heat signature suggested significant blood loss. Time was becoming a factor in ways that went beyond tactical considerations. But the enemy wasn't finished. As the Apache completed its second attack run, shoulder-fired missiles began launching from concealed positions throughout the compound. The aircraft's defensive systems detected the incoming threats and began dispensing chaff and flares, turning the morning sky into a light show that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. 3 missiles missed their mark, confused by the countermeasures and the Apache's evasive maneuvering. The fourth one didn't. The impact against the Apache's tail rotor assembly sent vibrations through the aircraft's frame that felt like being inside a bell during an earthquake. Warning lights flooded the cockpit with red illumination as multiple systems registered damage or complete failure. The aircraft began an unwelcome rotation around its vertical axis, the dreaded loss of tail rotor effectiveness that every helicopter pilot practiced in simulators, but hoped never to experience in combat. "Blackbird 6 is hit, repeat. Blackbird 6 is hit," she transmitted, fighting the controls as the Apache tried to spin itself into the ground. "Tail rotor damage, losing directional control." The words came out steady and professional, but her heart was beating fast enough to power a small turbine engine. Auto-rotation procedures flashed through her mind, the emergency landing technique that traded rotor energy for a controlled descent. It was possible, but it would put her on the ground in the middle of a hostile compound with no way to continue providing fire support. The decision came to her with startling clarity. The SEAL team was still 200 meters from the extraction point, still taking fire from positions that only the Apache could effectively engage. Landing meant abandoning them to whatever fate awaited. Continuing to fight meant risking a catastrophic loss of aircraft control that could kill everyone involved, including herself. But sometimes the choice isn't between good and bad options. Sometimes it's between acceptable losses and unacceptable ones. "Overwatch Blackbird 6 continuing the mission," she reported, using opposite rudder pedal pressure to counteract the aircraft's rotation. The technique worked, but at the cost of forward speed and maneuverability. She had become a slower, less agile target, but she was still a target with teeth. The third EM cannon remained functional, as did most of the aircraft's sensor suite. She could still hurt people who needed hurting. The third attack run took her directly through the heart of the enemy's defensive positions, the Apache flying barely 50 feet above the trenches at a speed that gave both sides only seconds to react. Muzzle flashes erupted from every fighting position as automatic weapons tried to track the damaged aircraft's erratic flight path. But the cannon's response was immediate and decisive. High-explosive rounds walked along the trench line like giants' footsteps, each impact sending debris and bodies flying in directions determined by physics and high explosives. "Neptune Actual, this is Blackbird 6, she called as she pulled the Apache into a climbing turn that sent new vibrations through the damaged airframe. "Path to extraction point is clear. Recommend you move now while I can still provide overwatch." The words carried an undertone that didn't need explanation. Her ability to continue fighting was measured in minutes, not hours. The aircraft was dying around her, held together by engineering margins and determination. The SEAL team's movement toward the extraction point became a race against time, mechanical failure, and the enemy's ability to regroup and coordinate their defensive fire. Through her targeting system, Captain Cowery watched the 6 heat signatures move across the compound's courtyard with the careful speed of professionals who understood that haste without precision was just another way to get killed. 2 of them continued to support their wounded teammate, whose heat signature had grown noticeably cooler over the past few minutes. Enemy fighters emerged from secondary positions throughout the compound as they realized the helicopter was damaged and potentially vulnerable. Fresh muzzle flashes began appearing from windows, doorways, and rooftop positions that had remained silent during the initial attack runs. The Apache's presence had stirred up the entire nest, and now everyone with a weapon wanted to be the one who brought down the American aircraft. "Blackbird 6, you've got multiple contacts moving to firing positions," came the transmission from Overwatch, their satellite feed providing an overview that her damaged sensors couldn't match. Grid coordinates follow. The numbers came through her headset like coordinates to salvation or damnation, depending on her ability to engage the targets before they could mass enough fire to finish what the missile had started. The fourth attack run required her to fly directly into the concentrated fire of at least 20 automatic weapons, their tracers creating a web of death that seemed impossible to navigate intact. But the Apache was built for exactly this kind of punishment, its armored cockpit and redundant systems designed to absorb battle damage and continue fighting. Rounds sparked off the aircraft's hull like deadly hail, but the 30 cannon continued its methodical destruction of anyone foolish enough to reveal their position. Taking heavy fire," she reported as something vital sounding gave way in the aircraft's engine compartment. New warning lights joined the constellation already illuminating her instrument panel, each one representing another system pushed beyond its operational limits. The Apache was bleeding hydraulic fluid, electrical power, and mechanical reliability with each passing second, but it was still flying and still fighting. The radio crackled with an update from Neptune Actual. Blackbird 6, we're at the extraction point. Where's our ride? The question highlighted another dimension of the tactical problem. The extraction helicopter couldn't approach the landing zone until the area was completely secured, and securing it required the continued presence of an attack helicopter that was rapidly approaching mechanical failure. It was a tactical catch-22 that had only one solution. Captain Cowery rolled the Apache into its fifth, and what she suspected might be its final attack run, aimed at the largest concentration of enemy fighters still engaging the SEAL team's position. The aircraft's flight controls felt increasingly unresponsive, requiring more and more input to achieve the same results. But the weapons systems remained functional, and that was all that mattered for the next 60 seconds. The cannon's final burst lasted 4 seconds and expended 93 rounds of ammunition, walking destruction across the enemy position with mechanical precision. When the dust settled, the surviving enemy fighters had either fled to deeper cover or ceased to be a factor in the tactical equation. The compound fell silent except for the sound of the Apache's struggling engines and the distant wop-wop-wop of the incoming extraction helicopter. Neptune Actual, Blackbird 6, she transmitted as she watched the U-60 Black Hawk approach the landing zone at maximum speed. Area is secure for extraction. Recommend you move fast. I can't guarantee how much longer I can provide overwatch. The words tasted like admission of defeat, but they were the tactical reality of a situation that had been balanced on the edge of catastrophe from the beginning. The extraction itself took less than 90 seconds. The SEAL team loaded their wounded teammate into the Black Hawk with the efficiency of people who had practiced the procedure, until it became muscle memory. As the helicopter lifted off and headed toward friendly territory, Captain Cowery found herself alone over the compound with an aircraft that was held together by little more than determination and the laws of physics. The Apache's final approach to Reaper Base occurred at an altitude and speed that would have been laughable under normal circumstances, but which represented the absolute maximum performance available from an aircraft that had absorbed more battle damage than most pilots see in an entire career. The landing was less a controlled descent than a barely managed crash, but the skids touched down on the forward operating base's landing pad with both aircraft and pilot intact. As the engines wound down and the rotor blades slowed to a stop, ground crews swarmed over the Apache to assess the damage and secure the aircraft. Captain Cowery remained in the cockpit for several minutes after shutdown, her hands still gripping the controls as adrenaline slowly faded from her system. She had brought everyone home alive, including herself. In the calculus of combat aviation, that represented an unqualified success regardless of the aircraft's condition. Colonel Harrison was waiting when she finally climbed out of the cockpit, his expression unreadable in the harsh morning sunlight. Behind him stood Major Watanabe, Staff Sergeant Vasquez, and what appeared to be half the base's personnel. Word of the successful extraction had traveled fast through the small community of forward operating Base Reaper. But the colonel's first words weren't about the mission or the damaged aircraft. "How are you feeling, Captain?" he asked, the question carrying layers of meaning that went beyond simple concern for her physical condition. She considered the question seriously, taking inventory of her emotional and physical state with the same methodical approach she used for aircraft systems. Her hands had stopped shaking, her heart rate had returned to something resembling normal, and the taste of adrenaline was fatting from her mouth. "I'm fine, sir," she replied, then paused and reconsidered. "Actually, I feel like I just did the job I trained for." The words carried more weight than their simple construction suggested, acknowledging both the successful completion of a dangerous mission and the personal significance of finally being allowed to demonstrate her capabilities under combat conditions. The Apache behind her looked like it had been through a blender, but 6 American servicemen were alive because she had been willing to fly it anyway. The debrief took place in the operations center an hour later, with Captain Cowery walking through each phase of the mission, while intelligence analysts and operational planners took notes for future reference. The language was clinical and professional: target coordinates, ammunition expenditures, battle damage assessments, and tactical recommendations. But beneath the military terminology was a story about people making life-and-death decisions in circumstances that allowed no margin for error. The aircraft sustained significant damage to the tail rotor assembly and hydraulic systems, she reported, reading from her hastily written notes. Total ammunition expenditure was approximately 400 rounds of 30. Enemy casualties are estimated at 15 to 20 killed, with an unknown number wounded. The numbers reduced the morning's events to statistical abstracts, but they couldn't capture the weight of decisions made in seconds or the sound of the Apache's struggling engines during the final approach. Major Watanabe leaned forward in his chair, consulting his tablet for the official after-action report template. "Captain, in your assessment, what factors contributed most significantly to mission success?" The question was standard procedure, designed to identify lessons learned and best practices for future operations. But the answer required her to articulate something that was easier to feel than to explain. "Situational awareness and weapons system familiarity," she replied after a moment's consideration, "and the willingness to continue the mission despite aircraft damage." The words sounded clinical, but they represented the difference between success and catastrophic failure. Another pilot might have attempted an emergency landing after the missile strike. Another pilot might not have been familiar enough with the Apache's capabilities to continue fighting with degraded systems. Colonel Harrison nodded slowly, making notes on his own copy of the mission summary. "The SEAL team leader specifically requested that his gratitude be passed along to the pilot of Blackbird 6, he said, looking up from his paperwork. "He said, and I quote, 'That pilot saved our asses and then some.'" The comment drew subtle smiles from several people around the table, but Captain Cowery felt only a quiet satisfaction at having met the expectations that came with the call sign. The official commendation paperwork would follow later, processed through channels that moved with the speed of continental drift and the efficiency of a bureaucracy designed by people who had never been shot at. But the real recognition had already occurred in the moments when the radio crackled with relief instead of desperation, when the extraction helicopter lifted off with everyone accounted for, when the Apache skids touched down at Reaper Base with aircraft and pilot intact. 2 days later, Captain Ezra Cowery found herself back in the ready room, looking out the window at a replacement Apache that had arrived on the morning logistics flight. The aircraft was identical to her previous mount in every technical specification, but it lacked the scars and character marks that came with combat experience. It was a clean slate, waiting to be written on by whoever would take it into harm's way next. The knock on the ready room door came exactly when she expected it would, but this time Colonel Harrison entered with a different expression, one that suggested the conversation would be about the future rather than the immediate past. Behind him came Major Watanabe and a woman she didn't recognize, wearing the uniform of a full colonel and the kind of bearing that suggested someone accustomed to making decisions that affected other people's lives. "Captain Cowery," Harrison began, "I'd like you to meet Colonel Patricia Vance from Aviation Branch. She's here to discuss some new opportunities that might interest you." The introduction carried undertones that suggested this wasn't a casual visit or a routine personnel consultation. Colonel Vance's presence meant someone at higher levels had taken notice of what happened during the extraction mission. Colonel Vance stepped forward with the kind of smile that was professional without being warm. "Captain, I've reviewed your service record and the after-action reports from your recent mission. Impressive work." She paused, consulting a folder that undoubtedly contained more information about Captain Cowery's career than the captain herself could recall. "We're forming a new unit focused on high-risk extraction and close air support missions. Interested in hearing more?" The offer represented everything she had worked toward since joining the Army: recognition based on demonstrated competence, assignments that matched her capabilities, and the opportunity to do the kind of work that made a measurable difference in other people's survival. But it also meant leaving behind the familiar routines of forward operating Base Reaper, the crew chiefs who knew her aircraft preferences, and the radio operators who had learned to distinguish her voice from dozens of others. "What kind of unit?" she asked, settling back into the metal chair that had become her favorite spot for watching aircraft operations through the ready room window. The question was less about gathering information than about buying time to process the implications of whatever Colonel Vance was proposing. Career decisions made in the immediate aftermath of successful combat missions had a tendency to look different after the adrenaline faded and the full consequences became apparent. "Special Operations Aviation Regiment," Vance replied, the unit designation carrying weight even among people who weren't familiar with its specific mission parameters. "Night Stalkers mostly, but they're expanding to include dedicated close air support elements. People who can fly and fight in conditions that would make most pilots request a transfer to safer assignments." The description was clearly intended to appeal to someone who had just demonstrated a willingness to continue fighting despite significant aircraft damage. Captain Cowery considered the offer while watching ground crews perform maintenance on the replacement Apache outside her window. The aircraft represented both continuity and change, the same basic platform she had grown to know intimately, but without the history and character marks that came with shared experiences in dangerous places. Moving to a new unit would mean starting over with unfamiliar aircraft, unknown crew members, and mission parameters that were probably classified at levels she hadn't yet achieved. "When would you need an answer?" she asked, recognizing that her response was already becoming apparent to everyone in the room. The question wasn't whether she would accept the offer, but how quickly she could arrange the transfer without abandoning her current responsibilities. The SEALs she had extracted 2 days earlier were still recovering from their wounds, but they were recovering because she had been willing to risk everything to bring them home safely. 2 weeks, Colonel Vance replied, closing the folder and standing to indicate the meeting was concluding. "Think about it, but don't think too long. Opportunities like this don't come around frequently, especially for pilots who have proven they can perform under pressure." She paused at the door, looking back with an expression that suggested she already knew what the answer would be. "Your call sign would transfer with you, by the way. Blackbird 6 has earned a certain reputation." After the others left, Captain Cowery remained in the ready room, watching the Afghan sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The radio chatter from the flight line provided a familiar backdrop of routine communications and standard procedures, the kind of background noise that had become as comfortable as her own heartbeat. But underneath it all was the awareness that everything was about to change, and that change was exactly what she had been working toward all along. The Apache outside her window would soon carry a different pilot into combat, someone who would learn its systems and capabilities through the same process of careful study and practical experience that she had followed. But the aircraft itself would remain essentially unchanged, a platform designed for delivering precise firepower in support of people who needed it most. The pilot made the difference between mechanical potential and combat effectiveness. That evening, she sat down to write a letter to her family back in Ohio, trying to find words that would explain what had happened without violating operational security or revealing more about her emotional state than she was comfortable sharing. The mission itself would remain classified for years to come, but the personal significance of finally being allowed to demonstrate her capabilities could be discussed in general terms. She had proven something to herself that was more important than external recognition. The letter took 3 attempts to write, each version struggling with the balance between honesty and discretion that characterized most military correspondence. How do you explain to people who have never been in combat what it means to have other people's lives depend entirely on your professional competence? How do you describe the weight of decisions made in seconds, or the satisfaction of bringing everyone home alive despite circumstances that seemed designed to prevent success? "I did the job I trained for," she finally wrote, the phrase carrying layers of meaning that her family would understand even if they couldn't share the specific experiences behind it. The Apache performed exactly as designed, and everyone came home safely. That's what matters most. The words were simple, but they captured the essential elements of what had occurred during those crucial minutes over the compound. 2 weeks later, Captain Ezra Blackbird 6 Cowery climbed into a different Apache helicopter at a different airfield, beginning the next phase of a career that had already exceeded her most optimistic projections. The aircraft was mechanically identical to her previous mount, but the mission parameters and operational environment would push both pilot and machine into territories that few people ever experienced. She was ready for the challenge. The mountains of Afghanistan fell away below as the helicopter gained altitude, carrying her toward assignments that were still classified and destinations that existed only as grid coordinates on maps she hadn't yet seen. But the fundamentals remained unchanged: an Apache helicopter, a pilot who knew how to use it, and the commitment to bring everyone home alive regardless of the obstacles involved. Everything else was just details. Years later, when other pilots asked about the mission that changed everything, she would tell them about the importance of systems knowledge, situational awareness, and the willingness to continue fighting when everything seemed to be falling apart. But she would also tell them about the sound of relief in a SEAL team leader's voice, the sight of an extraction helicopter lifting off with everyone accounted for, and the weight of responsibility that came with other people's survival, depending entirely on your professional competence. The call sign, Blackbird 6, would become legend in certain circles, attached to missions and achievements that were recorded in classified files and shared in conversations that occurred only among people who had earned the right to hear them. But for Captain Ezra Cowery, it would always represent the moment when years of training and preparation translated into the ability to make a difference when it mattered most. The Apache had been built for exactly that purpose. So had she.